What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Empire of Sin. Now, I review games after 100% all the time, but for this particular review, I was going to change my approach a little bit, and that is because when Empire of Sin launched, I heard it had quite a few problems. It was a game I was keeping an eye on, it looked pretty interesting, but then I heard about all the launch issues, and I was pretty busy at the time anyway, so I decided to give it a pass and come back to it when I had time, which is obviously now, and just kind of make an assessment, see how it was doing. So that's going to be kind of the point of this review, I suppose you could say. And in that regard, I think the game, in terms of being playable and in a better state, etc., is very much so the case. Especially with the latest update, the Precinct update that went live last November, changed the game pretty substantially. And just reading through some of the changes that have been made since launch that playing through the game I enjoyed very much, I can see that the absence of those things definitely contributed to why this game didn't do well at launch. But while playing through this title, I ran into what I would consider the bigger, broader problem with this game and why I don't think it's ever going to do particularly well in a broad sense, if you will. And that is because Empire of Sin, I think, failed to answer a very basic question with its gameplay and its structure, and that is, who is this game supposed to be for? Because if you're unaware, Empire of Sin is a sort of combination between a more story-based RPG, depending on the character you pick, as well as a sort of strategy game that sees you taking over Chicago via one of many mob bosses you can choose to play as. And I want to color the beginning of this review by saying Empire of Sin is fairly light in both of those regards. On one hand, it's not really a substantial enough RPG to keep somebody like myself interested who loves story-based RPGs, with an emphasis on CRPGs in particular. And on the other side of things, there's not enough strategy gameplay here either to keep those players interested. And while I wouldn't say there's anything particularly wrong about the way they handled either of those aspects, it's just that neither of them are really deep enough to warrant more interaction from their appropriate audiences. And typically speaking, the people that enjoy one of those things aren't that involved with the other, to the point where Empire of Sin really only manages to be good for somebody who's really trying to get into strategy games as like a good jumping off point. Because Empire of Sin does have a fairly competent strategy system, it's just not deep enough to hold somebody who's super into strategy games. And thus, it's a great jumping off point if you're looking to get into strategy games, but that's about it. So from here, let's jump into a few other aspects of the title. Now, as I mentioned, the primary goal is to take over Chicago neighborhoods as your associated mob boss. You actually get to pick one of many mob bosses. Each has their own unique abilities and perks that they can bring to your empire, if you will, because you will be building businesses through rackets, and each individual mob boss gets some bonuses in that regard. They also get some unique combat abilities for the turn-based combat, which we'll get into a little bit later in the review. And then once we actually get into the neighborhoods of Chicago, we will actually also be building a team of gangsters to help us in combat. These gangsters also come with their own unique classes, if you will, professions. These guys are actually set in stone. You get a choice of about 60 or so of them. They each actually also come with their own little stories, as does your mob boss, which can help vary up your playthroughs of the strategy side of things a little bit, as depending on the characters you choose to run with, they will offer up slightly different quests for you to complete as you run through a game. Now, in terms of how we are actually taking over Chicago, we do this by taking over rackets and neighborhoods. So each neighborhood is divided up into precincts, and the amount of factions as well as the neighborhoods in your game is adjustable. So depending on how long you want the game to last, you can kind of take it down to, I believe, 7 at a minimum in terms of neighborhoods, and I believe it's 13 at a maximum in terms of neighborhoods, which will give you more territory to take over, etc. But within each precinct, you can find buildings that you can then establish rackets in, rackets being either brothels, speakeasies, breweries to make the alcohol to supply your businesses. You can get into loan sharking if you have the DLC, etc. Now, you and every other major enemy faction will be doing the same thing. The major enemy factions are controlled by mob bosses that you did not choose. So if you didn't choose to play as one, those are the same people that you will be up against in terms of taking over Chicago. Now, there are strategy elements to this. You can form alliances, you can trade, you can offer truces and business arrangements with other factions. There are minor factions which don't really ever have a chance of taking over, but you can choose to protect them or deal with them or trade with them, etc. Combine this with the fact that all of the gangsters you have access to, if they're not working for you, they're probably working for one of the other factions. All of the gangsters have relationships among themselves, which is all well and good, but truthfully, after about 10 hours, you've seen every interaction there's going to be. But that said, how do we actually take over territory, etc., from the enemy factions? Well, this starts by declaring a war on them, or they might declare war on you. And at this point, you're going to be trying to take over each other's rackets. Now, each individual precinct that a character owns is going to be divided up into rackets and the depot. Each precinct will have a depot and the rackets. You have to attack all the rackets and then ideally attack the depot. Because if you don't take out the rackets first and you just go straight for the depot will get reinforcements. And while this can be cheesed a little bit with some exploitable mechanics, generally speaking, that's the way that works. So you're going to take over their businesses, you're going to sack their depot, and then at that point you'll get to take over that precinct, acquiring all of their businesses as your own. But in order to do this, we have to engage in the turn-based combat. The combat itself is fairly robust. I've played worse turn-based combat systems. It is very reminiscent of Shadowrun, strangely enough, in its action point system. You'll have 2 action points. Most things can be done by spending one of them. Some actions will cost 2 action points, but oftentimes you'll be able to move or attack with those action points, and attacking usually ends your turn regardless of whether or not you would have action points left, which is essentially the same thing as the Shadowrun combat system. And while your characters won't level up in the typical sense, they can, over time, learn abilities because time is passing. And, days and weeks and years are going by as you're playing the game. And as those go by, you can teach your mobsters new abilities and perks, if you will. You can also outfit them with better weapons, armor, etc. So you can kind of build them up into a more well-equipped outfit. And this is made easier by finding stashes out in the open world, for lack of a better term. So on the strategy map, you will be able to actually move your characters through the city, and you can find stashes of items that will then help you equip your characters, or you can just buy them straight from the black market menu. But again, after a few hours, you've pretty much seen all of the variations here, as it basically boils down to melee or a few different types of weaponry, such as shotguns, machine guns, submachine guns, etc. And each gangster class tends to specialize, if you will, in one of those things, but because the gangsters have classes, they're all fairly similar in how they function. And really the mob bosses are the only people who have unique abilities going on. So again, after you've played for a while, you've basically seen everything in 10-ish hours. Now, in terms of DLC, there's a couple, and unfortunately, they're both pretty underwhelming. The first one just adds a couple more mob bosses that you can pick from, which, really doesn't change that much outside of 1 or 2 quests. And the fact that they put it behind a paywall, I'm not a fan of. And then there is the Make It Count DLC, which is more like a proper expansion DLC, if you will. This adds a new mob boss as well as a couple systems like the loan sharking racket, a new gangster class called the Fixer, etc. Which by itself, pretty solid addition, but quite frankly, not really worth the $15 asking price that they want for it, which we'll circle back to. But let's talk positives and negatives real quick. On the positive side of things, they really did nail the theme. So obviously, the whole 1920s gangster vibe in early Chicago is what they were going for. And that part of it, I think, is done pretty well. The little bit of story that is here is decent. The turn-based combat, again, not exactly a deep system, but it's competent. I enjoyed it while I played it. And then there's the negative side of thing that unfortunately every system is just very shallow. Each gangster and mob boss has a few story quests, etc., but the gangsters get literally 1 quest per gangster, and then your mob bosses get about 4 or 5 story missions a playthrough that just kind of reinforce their background a little bit. They really don't add much to the experience. And then there's the strategy systems, which again, none of them are bad per se, there's just not a lot to them, and you've kind of figured it all out after a handful of hours. And then once you've figured out what works and what doesn't, every run of the game is basically the same outside of the unique mob boss that you're playing with. Because even their unique abilities and stuff just really isn't enough to vary the gameplay in any substantial way. Which brings me to the conclusion for this review. Overall, the game's not bad. Everything that it tries to do, it does okay. It's just that there's not enough of the things that it tries to do. Which brings me back to my initial question of who was the audience they had in mind for this game. because the people like myself who really love a turn-based combat system that's heavy on the story aren't going to be into this because the story's not really there. The people who enjoy strategy games aren't really going to be into this. The people playing for the combat would be better served by playing a different game that has more going on for the combat. So even as a TRPG, it comes up short, which really, again, makes me feel like whenever this game was in development, they just failed to ask themselves who the audience was. Which, again, as an introduction to like strategy games or even turn-based combat, it's not bad, but the experienced players aren't going to have enough here to really sink their teeth into, which is a problem that is amplified by the price of this game, which I haven't really talked about yet. The base game is $40. However, there are 2 DLCs that if you buy bundled with the main game is $70. The individual DLCs are simply too expensive. So at full asking price, there just isn't enough game here for me to really recommend for the price that they are asking for this. So while it's not a bad game, none of the systems are bad per se at this particular point. And if you ever catch the game on sale, you maybe want to check it out because if nothing else, the mobster vibe is pretty cool. However, again, there is just no way that I would pay full price for this. I actually bought this on a sale. I believe it was like $20-something way back when I knew I was going to cover it, but I just hadn't got around to it yet, which feels like a better price, frankly, because again, paying full price for this particular game that just isn't very engaging past like the 10-hour mark, in my opinion, is just asking for way too much money for not enough product. But there you go, guys. There is my review after 100% for Empire of Sin. Definitely an odd title. It has some things going for it, and there's everything I have to say about it. So, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.